Hi, and welcome to Python PyTest. This is part one. I'm Norman McIntyre. Let's get started. So here's your reference information, pytest.org. A lot of good information there. You'll spend a lot of time reading and studying that. We'll pick up the highlights here in this presentation. So let's begin at the very beginning. Skill point 1, PyTest is a testing framework, and it's aimed at making your testing easy. So you can't complain about that, right? Make your testing easy and make your testing scalable. So you can keep adding more tests and getting your project bigger and bigger, and PyTest will automatically scale with your project. Skill point number 2, PyTest are expressive and readable, so you don't have to worry about putting any special boilerplate code. Here's an example of that. The PyTest dot raises 0 division error. So essentially we're saying that we're going to run this test, in this case a test divided by 0, and during this test we're expecting to have a divide by 0, and so that PyTest raises 0 division error. It's expecting that to happen. So easy to see how the test is written. Skill point number 3, PyTest will auto-discover test modules and functions. So the way you'll use this is you'll just type PyTest at the top of your project directory, and as long as you use the naming conventions, which we'll cover, as long as you have the naming conventions, the PyTest will auto-discover all your tests. Skill point number 4, PyTest can run the test we have previously covered. That is, all the things we've talked about, the unit test and also the nose 2 test. It can run those, and you can see how that makes sense because we know that unit test is built into Python and then nose 2 builds on top of that. Well, PyTest you could think of as even building on top of both of these. Skill point number 5, PyTest has modular test fixtures. In fact, we're not going to cover that in this part 1. We'll cover it in part 2 later in the course. Skill point number 6, PyTest has over 300 external plugins. So this is another thing that makes it quite exciting, and we'll cover that also in part 2 later in this course. Skill point number 7, you can install PyTest using pip, just like other things you've installed. So here I'm doing a pip3 install PyTest, and it goes and installs everything you need. Skill point number 8, if you want to find out which version you're using, do a pytest -- version, and you can see here when I ran it, in this case I was on a Mac and I ran pytest -- version, and you can see that we've got version 5.2.0. So you can write actually a minimum PyTest in only 4 lines of code. So here I created a file called test_demo.py. When you're naming your files, your test files should begin with test as the prefix. So here I've said test_demo.py. By naming it like that, the PyTest command will automatically find these particular tests. Notice in this 4-line demonstration I have a define of a function called sum, and of course it just returns the sum of num1 plus num2, and then I also have a define of a test of that sum, and notice I'm doing an assert that the sum, when I pass in 40 and 2, I'm asserting that it should be equal to 42. So very clean, straightforward code. And here when I run PyTest, what it will do is look in the directory, the current directory, and it finds this test.demo.py. It tells me that it collected one item. It runs the test that's in there. Of course, we just have a single test, and it says that it passed. So that's showing the successful when it runs with success. Here we'll go just make a minor change. I'll make it where I change it where it's does not run successfully. And in this case, when I run it, notice I change my assert. So here where I'm asserting the sum should equal 42, instead notice the assert I got 80 when I ran this. So what I did, I went into the code and changed it where it showed doing a multiplication instead of a addition. And I did this just for demonstration purposes. You can see that it shows that we had an assertion error. It shows the line number where the assertion error was at, and of course it says that we had one test that failed. Skill point number 11, pytest will allow all lines of the form test underscore or star underscore test. It will basically find all of those in your current directory and in your subdirectories, and it'll run all of those tests. Pytest allows you to assert that a given exception is raised. So we saw this earlier, but here's a better example. I go to pytest.raises, and here when pytest.raises, I say I'm looking for this zero division error. In other words, I'm expecting this to happen. In fact, here's an example of that in this import test. When I run this, I get a notice I say pytest.raises, and I get the zero division error because I'm doing a divide by zero. So I'm expecting that to be raised, and so since it's raised, everything's good, and I pass the test. On the other hand, here I have a test failure because I'm saying pytest raises zero division error, so I'm expecting to get a zero division error. But in this case, when I do my divide 10, 1, I do not get the division error, and so my test fails. Notice it tells me very clearly it did not raise this zero division error. Skill point 13, pytest allows you to group multiple tests into a single class. And what's pretty cool, you don't have to worry about subclassing. You can just group all your tests together. So here's an example of that. Notice I have a class called test demo, and importantly, if you think back to when we did an earlier lesson on using unit test, we saw that unit test actually required us to subclass from the unit or the test case class. But here we don't have to do that. We just say we're going to have a class. In this case, I said test demo. And notice in my test demo, I have a test sum and I have a test divide by zero. So I've collected those tests into a single class. Notice on the right side of the screen, I do a pytest. It starts up the session. It finds that I've got 2 items to test. And of course, in this case, they both pass. So in summary, pytest makes testing easier. There's this single pytest command, and it runs all the tests because of this auto discovery of tests. We've seen that tests can be written using simple asserts, and you can also put all your tests into a single class, and that class can be written without subclassing from the test case class. And there's even more to come in a later lesson when we look at the modular test fixtures and also the external plugins. I'm Norman McIntyre. Thanks as always for watching.